Welcome to this Conveyancing Matters chat when Stu and Lorraine will be talking to Heather Crichton from Pexa. Welcome to Conveyancing Matters with Lorraine and Stu. Join us for a chat about all things property. Welcome to this Conveyancing Matters chat. Stu and I are delighted to welcome Heather Crichton from Pexa. So hello, Heather.
Hi, Lorraine. Hi, Stu, and hi to everyone tuning in.
Thank you for joining us, Heather. So, firstly, tell us where you are. Tell us where you are, Heather.
Where I am, well, I'm on the other side of the world to Lorraine. I come to you from Melbourne, but having just spent about 18 months in the UK.
Yeah, so you've spent the sort of vortex of the property time in the UK, Heather. So you've I think really kind of been here at a difficult time, I think. So
I've seen a lot, but isn't that normal?
Well,
No.
I don't know. Stu would be better to answer that than me.
Completely abnormal.
Okay, 3 prime ministers in as many months, not normal. Got it.
Yeah, that was fun, and the ensuing property traumas as a result of such a dismal budget. Oh dear, that's just internationally embarrassing, really, isn't it? I think whatever your politics, to be honest, but there we go. So, Heather, we are really delighted to welcome you from Pexa, and actually we'll perhaps talk about the sort of what you've seen of the English and property market in a moment. But Pexa's a name that really wasn't known to really many people at all, except those of us like nerds like Stu and I who have been looking actually interestingly at what's been going on sort of globally with the property market. So Heather, you've certainly got out there in the last couple of years. So tell us a bit about Pexa, how it started, what it does, your entry into the UK market. Tell us a bit about the company.
I'd love to. So Pexa, confusingly or perhaps not so, is both a who and a what. Maybe think of us like Kleenex in that regard, although that might be more familiar to American audiences. So I think both can be addressed by sharing a little about our history and evolution, and hopefully that addresses what you've just asked, Lorraine. So here in Australia, we actually evolved from a federal government initiative just over 10 years ago now with the intention of digitising conveyancing. And I know that has now become a very overused phrase, and particularly in the UK means all manner of things. But all those years ago in Australia, what digitisation in this context really meant was the back half of the conveyancing process. So when it comes time to plan for completion, that's when Pexa was becoming relevant or hoped to become relevant. You might be familiar as property nerds that you've just confessed to me that here in Australia, we have the joy of being a federation of states and territories. And so the sale and transfer of property here is actually regulated at state and territory level. And that has led to, or did lead to, quite a lot of nuances in the process over the years. And of course, when we think about that in really practical terms, for lenders and law firms who operate across the country, that led to a lot of inefficiencies and probably fairly large operational overheads as well. So if we think about that in the context of how completions were affected back in the day, and something I hadn't shared with you, but you might be aware of, is I started my career as a lawyer, so qualified as a solicitor like both of you, and spent a number of years working in property. And certainly when I was a baby lawyer, one of my key responsibilities was going along to completions. So what we started with, or where we started pre-Pexa, was actually a position well behind where the UK is today. And I know every jurisdiction has their own challenges, but we had some fairly serious ones. So a completion for us actually involved a physical meeting between representatives for the buyer and the seller and each of the lenders. So this actually meant that a date and a time and a location had to be agreed, where all parties would meet and where the certificate of title would be exchanged along with a lot of other pieces of paper, I'm sure you can imagine, in exchange for funds. And this is where most people tend to crack up laughing. The funds were in the form of checks. So we were keeping checks alive and kicking, this industry here in Australia. a missing piece of paper, a signature mismatch, a check being out by a few dollars, any of those things and more trivial, I promise you I've seen it, they could lead to a completion being delayed. So you'd all either sort of be trying to desperately come back that afternoon, or maybe it would be pushed to the next day, or at worst, maybe longer than that. So not an amazing experience for consumers trying to buy and sell. We have each year, or probably several times a year now, particularly post-COVID, but an occasion where our heads of state come to meet, heads of each state and territory come to meet. And one year, all those years ago, the idea of having a seamless national economy was being discussed, and this was intended to come up with a number of initiatives that would make it easier for businesses to operate across the country, so to reduce some of the inefficiencies that had just, I guess, transpired organically. And from what I recall, there were 27 initiatives thought of and put together at this meeting. Number 27 was e-conveyancing. I don't know that anyone knew what e-conveyancing was. But how that had come to be there was lenders in particular had lobbied for some sort of solution, lobbied government for some sort of solution. Government had popped it on the agenda at this meeting and then swiftly turned around and said, actually, we think we need private enterprise to bring this about. And so Pexa was spun up for that reason. We weren't sort of in existence doing something else before that. Our sole purpose was to develop some sort of digital conveyancing solution. So Pexa was born, we needed some money like any new business. And so it was thought, well, who would be the key beneficiaries of something like a digitised conveyancing experience? And ultimately it was determined that probably the governments would be, because of the efficiencies, and likewise the major lenders. So they were actually kind enough to provide our initial funding and then ongoing funding over the years. The first few years of our existence, as you can imagine, was spent building the software. It took a while. What we were trying to do was world first. So there was no blueprint to follow. This was certainly before my time there. I don't profess to be a techie at all. But where we kind of got to was we knew we needed a digital lodgement solution. We needed to get rid of those pieces of paper that were taking up completion times. So that was certainly a consideration, the main consideration. But if we think also about the horror story of checks that I've just told you about, we knew we needed to solve for that as well. We knew we needed to get rid of checks once and for all in the industry. So we worked fairly closely with the land registries across the country. And as I've just said, because of being a federation, there's not one HMLR, there are 8 across the country. So worked with them to build digital lodgement capability, and each of them have their own sort of various lodgement rules, business rules that have to be catered for. But in doing so, and I'm probably fast forwarding a little bit, in doing so, what we've been able to do together with the land registries is bring our requisition rates down from probably between that 20 to 30% mark, which I know is the standard in the UK, down to a fraction of a percent, which is quite a win in many ways. And then we move on to funds exchange and needing to kill off the check once and for all. So we engaged the central bank here in Australia, the Reserve Bank, which is the Bank of England equivalent, talked with them about what we might be able to do together. And ultimately we've developed a payments process with them that allows funds to move directly at central bank level. And we've intertwined that. That's my really techie word. Sometimes I actually say glue as well. We've intertwined that with our lodgement capability such that one can't occur without the other. So that brings quite a bit of comfort to the industry. So that's probably a lot to understand if you've not come across us before. So I guess a very quick, very high level summary is of what Pexa is we've developed a platform that allows lenders and law firms to work collaboratively to complete the tasks they need to submit an application for registration with the land registry and to exchange funds. And then if we fast forward through to today, through probably a sizable amount of blood, sweat and tears, all of the lenders here in Australia are registered customers of ours, just about every law firm. I say just about because we've got 2 smaller jurisdictions to bring Pexa to here. Around 85% of the country's property transactions are now facilitated through Pexa, and we just ticked over 3 trillion Australian dollars worth of property value settled. So huge achievement for the industry. And I think it's often interpreted as an overnight success story. If overnight equals 10 years, then that's absolutely accurate. It's usually that sort of situation, isn't it, where people think someone's just sprung up overnight, but there's been a lot going on behind the scenes.
That was actually Heather, that reminds me, there's a really good, everybody thinks of like indie band over here called Elbow. Well, they're all kind of middle-aged men now, but they kind of hit their kind of zenith around about the time of the 2012 Olympics in London, because they kind of, I don't know, played at the opening or the closing ceremony. I can't remember which, and you know, that came up a lot. Actually, there's a guy, the lead singer's a guy called Guy Garvey. And you know, they said, "Oh, you're overnight successes," and he said, "Yeah, but well, not really." So we've been grafting away at this for 17 years, in pubs and God knows what else. So that's kind of exactly the thing, really. So, Heather, do you in Oz Pexa? Do you essentially does Pexa kind of link into the land registry, so you get the registration and the money transfer done kind of simultaneously? So you've got no registration gap.
Correct. Well, correct to a point. So we facilitate lodgement, and then because of the various rules that the land registries have given to us, and we've been able to build into our platform, because of that, what we typically find is a very little, if any, registration gap. Some jurisdictions do take a little bit longer than others, but what we typically find is a registration will occur within minutes of a completion executing. So it's very, very small, as long as those various requirements are met. Some things will go for manual examination. That's probably always going to be the case, but the vast majority of vanilla transactions, you can almost be certain your name will be on title within minutes.
Gosh, that's a bit of a holy grail job at the moment, Stu.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds really, really impressive. So without sort of the obvious, I suppose, problems we have here with the land registry, what made Pexa decide to target the UK of all markets then?
Great question. Another cause for a trip down memory lane. I've shared with you the overnight / 10-year success story. Over the course of those 10 odd years, I guess as more and more transactions were flowing through our platform, I think other jurisdictions, other Torrens title jurisdictions, it's probably fair to say, were starting to express some curiosity, and we actually had people from a number of other countries come to visit us on occasion. But I think for the longest time, we were just so focused on getting Australia to a certain point. And certainly because we had sort of been born out of that government initiative, we had an obligation to get to a certain point as well. I think we just weren't ready for a while. Pre-COVID, seems like a world away now, pre-COVID, I think something that happened that gave us a bit of a boost confidence-wise was having a visit from several representatives from some UK lenders to Australia. We'd already been, I think, starting to dip our toes in the water, maybe research-wise in other jurisdictions. But we had a couple of visitors from your shores, and they were quite interested in what we've been able to achieve with industry. I suspect maybe their initial thinking had been, I wonder if we could do what they have done, and they fairly quickly realised that it's not exactly a simple piece of infrastructure, nor is it cheap to develop. But it gave us the shot in the arm I think we needed. So it was late in 2020 that we formally planted a flag in the UK. I think we had sort of been coming and going for a couple of years doing reconnaissance, but late 2020, the board approved our expansion to the UK, funding granted, and very crucially, I think a UK CEO, James Bauer, appointed, and he started to build a local team. So we're at about 40 in the UK now. But if we go back a little bit, I think knowing that there were similarities in the process because we both leverage Torrens title was good, and something we would consider for future expansions as well. And I often say, if you're sort of standing up on the balcony and looking down, the processes are very, very similar. We know the devil is in the detail, and of course there are differences, and some of them very fundamental, but broadly speaking, we're confident that we can bring our solution to the UK and work with industry to tailor it.
So you've been in the UK now, I think, for a couple of years, Heather. So where, forgive me, because obviously, as I said, Stu and I see the Pexa logo, you know, supporting a lot of, you know, conveyancing sort of products, conferences, whatever, obviously to kind of raise the profile and what have you. But but in terms, so where is Pexa at right now, as in, you know, early 2023, in terms of, you know, the England and Wales market? We shouldn't say UK because it's not, you know, across the board. So where are you at in terms of, you know, England and Wales and the product in those countries?
Yeah, great question. Let's get down to business. So we have developed brand new software for the UK. I think one of the main concerns of industry was that we were just going to bring Pexa Australia over and plug it in and expect it would work. So we know there are very key differences, as I mentioned before. So we've been working with ThoughtWorks, who's an international software consultancy, to build brand new technology for the UK. We have worked with the Bank of England to build a payment system, which is called Pexa Pay. It's just the 7th net settlement payment scheme to settle through the Bank of England, and the only one that's dedicated to property in the UK. So that's a key component of Pexa's offering in the UK. So that means, broadly speaking, what we've been able to bring to market resembles what we have in Australia. But then where are we at right now? Because all of this sounds lovely, but if it's not doing anything, then I appreciate it's fairly nebulous. We launched last September, with a remortgage product. And that was very deliberate product-wise. We started with a similar approach here in Australia. We started with, we call them refinances. We started with refinance because it's a simpler experience than sale purchase, for reasons that I'm sure you and everyone who watches this series is familiar with, but also meant that we needed to have those connections in place with HMLR. We needed the payments, the ability to move money. We needed to build an environment to allow lenders and law firms to come together, but we didn't need to sort of force a very big change on industry all at once. Our CEO often refers to an analogy where we sort of bring the industry to the edge of the cliff and pushing them over, and that's not what we wish to do. So remortgage, I think, is a nice gentle way, or I hope is a nice gentle way.
Which really, I think, Heather, is it more subtle than that? As you kind of push them, does Pexa want to be there with the, you know, with the, or are you all holding an edge of the sheet to catch us all?
Maybe we should expand that analogy to include that.
Yeah. Or the big sheet, and when everyone's falling down, they're just looking at you all holding a sheet with Pexa written on it. No, there's a marketing idea for you.
Anyone that we're playing superheroes here, but we would very much like to support the industry. So that's where we are milestone wise. This year for us is really about building out the remortgage experience. So as with any software, it is iterative. So we add more features and make the features a little bit more sophisticated as time goes on, most of which is a result of feedback from industry. So both lenders and firms that we're working on. We don't want to deliver something to market that people don't want. But crucially, we're also working on developing a sale and purchase product, which tends to be what most people are interested in, unsurprisingly, and we're targeting delivery of that next year.
Okay, that's interesting. Are you, and again, forgive my ignorance here, Heather, but are you, is Pexa going to be, are you trying to achieve what the Land Registry wanted to try to achieve back in 2002 with e-conveyancing? So, you know, are you linking into the registration side of things, or are you, I say just, that sounds a terrible way of putting it, but I say just dealing with the money transfers, or are you, is the objective to actually link in to end up with, you know, sort of, you know, no registration gap, simultaneous, you know, registration on completion, that sort of thing? That's the bit I'm not quite understanding.
I think that would be our North Star, but it would be very naive of me to suggest that that's something that we could do in isolation. So here in Australia, that came about as a result of working very closely with the land registries. And as I mentioned before, we were coming from a very low base. It didn't take me too long when I got to the UK in 2021 to realise that digital lodgement wasn't really a big deal to the industry because you already had it. So we would love to get there. It would involve cooperation with HMLR. We know that they have fairly ambitious digital plans. We would like to support those where we are able to, where it makes sense to, but we're not, I guess we're not so silly as to suggest that we're their saviour, for example, but we would like to get to a point where that registration gap that we know causes quite a lot of headache for the industry in England and Wales isn't there, or perhaps there's an experience with that's more akin to what we have in Australia.
Is the challenge though not the fact that, because I mean, you know, Stu and I have experienced this, the industry here experiences this, of course, with electronic signatures. So the land registry will now accept them. It's got its very specific requirements. The land registry, I think, was working with something like about 20 or 30 organisations on e-signatures, but couldn't endorse any one of them, and just says, well, here they all are. Is that not a similar challenge for you as a private organisation with essentially a government agency like the land registry? That how do you know they can't endorse you, can they? How does that work?
Well, I don't think I need a crystal ball to say they would never endorse us, nor any other for-profit business, or probably any business for that matter. And it's not something that we would be so bold as to ask for. We hope that in time, and we appreciate it's really early days for us in the UK, that the product speaks for itself. And if we're able to share some of our learnings from the 6 and hopefully soon 8 land registries that we've worked with in Australia with HMLR, share some insights as to how we got to that very limited registration gap that we might be able to, as I said, get industry to where we are in Australia. That would be an incredible outcome. But it is really early days for us at the moment. So we're focusing, I suppose, our efforts on working really closely with the lenders and law firms we're engaged with, and making the product as best it can. And I would hope, and hopefully I don't have my head in the clouds, but I would hope in time that the product speaks for itself.
So just out of interest, Heather,
maybe my head is in the clouds.
It's probably where it has to be in a way, Heather. You know, you have to, you know, and I mean that in the nicest possible way. I think if you spend a lot of time thinking about all the negatives, nothing would get done. Sorry, Stu, off you go. I'm
just going to say, I'm assuming obviously the product is dependent on all sort of stakeholders working together. So what kind of engagement have you had with law firms and their experience of using the product so far, and also lenders? Because lenders obviously pivotal to the whole process, and as you know, conveyancers, we're always under pressure from the banks, but they do often remain very quiet when we talk about the actual process. So what's the engagement been like so far with lenders in terms of volume? Are they all on board, or?
Good question. I feel like I just need to summarize it back to you so I don't forget any part of it. Engagement with lenders, engagement with firms, and then maybe some sort of collective piece where we talk about working with them together. So on the lender front, something I didn't mention when I spoke about working with the Bank of England to develop the payment scheme is, excuse me, that they have a requirement that lenders who use Pexa Pay test it before, I suppose, becoming fully fledged users of the scheme. And what that's meant for us is in onboarding lenders, they need to test Pexa Pay, and the Bank of England grants us semi-regularly some testing slots that we can use with lenders. So we're engaged with a number of lenders, and I have to be a little bit, excuse me again, I have to be a little bit ambiguous here because Pexa is a listed company here in Australia. So the two I can share that we are engaged with who are using Pexa at the minute are Hinckley and Rugby Building Society, who we launched with in September, and Shawbrook Bank, who came onto the network just before Christmas. So working with them, working with a number of others as well. Their feedback has been one of how to summarize. They're really excited, I think, about what the future holds. I think everyone is looking for ways they can provide more certainty to consumers in the home buying, home selling, home remortgaging process. A lot of lenders, well, a lot of organisations, full stop, came out of COVID with fairly hefty transformation programs, digital transformation programs, and some lenders have seen Pexa as being an enabler of that. So we've had really positive feedback from them. Of course, we don't want to underestimate the level of change that's required in an organisation like a lender. They're large, they've got layers of approvals to go through and change management guidelines to observe. So we're working with them where we're able to support them through those changes. On the law firm front, because we have launched with a remortgage product, we're I often describe this as being sort of lender-led in a way. So when a lender has come on, they've said to us, can you work with X law firm or law firms if they've got a couple that they're working with, and then we will work with them to ready them for Pexa. So for my role at Pexa, which has been focused on engaging with the legal profession, this has sort of placed almost a natural limitation on what I can do, because I can't go out to the entire industry and say, hey, we're Pexa, sign up and start using us tomorrow, because there's just not an opportunity for them to do so yet. I really wish there was, but there's not. So in terms of usage by law firms, it's been the law firms who have supported Hinckley and Rugby and Shawbrook, and we can share that was Move and Pure Law respectively. That doesn't mean that we're not engaged with other firms. So we shared just last week that we've welcomed 3 more law firms to the network, and we're engaged with a number of others, and that's primarily been because, or for a variety of reasons, they've reached out to us. We've identified them as fairly innovative, fairly progressive firms, and we want to make sure that we're taking their feedback on board. So I mentioned before, we don't want to put a product into market that isn't useful to people, that people aren't going to use. So we're really focused on taking on feedback, on gathering insights on the experience from people who are at the call front. What's good, what's bad, what's pretty ugly. And then I guess feeding that back to them. So saying, if we developed a feature that did this, would that help you? And then well, you've worked with this industry longer than I have, not really backwards in coming forwards to tell us if something will work or not. And that's the kind of relationship we need. So at the moment, as I said, fairly natural limitation to the volume of firms that we can engage with, which doesn't mean that we're not happy to speak to everyone, but it will more be when we get to a sale purchase delivery. So sometime next year, we're targeting, that we'll be really excited to bring on more firms and hear what they've got to say in particular. And then you mentioned, I nearly forgot, but I guess the collective experience. So what we found here in Australia when we were getting going, and I must admit I've probably heard very similar, if not the same feedback in the UK, is that there is a certain tension between lenders and firms at times, even though I guess we're all working towards the same outcome and have the same customer. And I won't suggest that Pexa is a silver bullet that will fix that, because some of that's fairly entrenched, but we hope that by not having a decoupled experience for the two parties, so by bringing lender and firm together in that collaborative environment that we've built, that having visibility over task completion, for example, and the ability to communicate might simmer some of those tensions.
So how does, just explain to me, so Stu's, head of a big law firm that has, gazillions of completions a month or whatever on sales and purchases. So how would, for a law firm like Stu's and his people in the completions team, Heather, how does Pexa Pay change the experience from what they do now to what you would hope, within reason is achievable within the sale and purchase environment? Because the remortgage environment is very different. I mean, the Land Reg put out some stuff fairly recently, some work they've done with a big remortgage outfit on actually getting their requisition rates down, which was kind of fine and perfectly laudable thing to do. But, Stu and I, when we talked about it privately, we sort of said, didn't we, well, that's all very well, but, the remortgage market's very different.
Yes. Well, I mentioned that's why we deliberately started with remortgage, because
so how does Pexa Pay then sort of, how does it change the experience and the job of Stu's completion team?
So I guess a few pieces of background information. One, just to clarify, Pexa Pay is the payment scheme, so it's part of the Pexa solution, but not the solution. With Stu's team, I fear I'm going to have to revert to talking about the Australian experience, because we are all sitting on the edges of our seat waiting to hear what our sale purchase offering will look like. So we've had various people, internal and external, work on what this might look like. It's sort of going through the channels of approval at the moment. So when we're able to share a little bit more about that, we absolutely can. So I'll have to go with what I know and talk to how it works in Australia at the moment, if you and your viewers will indulge me. So not exactly relevant to the UK market, but we killed off those awful face-to-face meetings because everything is done digitally, of course, and got rid of checks. Not really an issue for the UK. You were already ahead of us in that respect. But I mentioned before the currently fairly decoupled experience between lenders and law firms. So we've been able to support their coming together a little bit more, which has meant fewer attempts at chasing for updates required. So where are you up to with this? When are you sending funds? When will they be received, et cetera, et cetera. So that very much is a thing of the past in Australia, and as you can imagine, has reduced inefficiencies quite a lot. Funds appearing in accounts within minutes, really, so very, very quickly. So not having to wait for confirmation that everything is fine there. And I suppose in the context of the UK experience, I've heard this described as floating finances, where funds do sort of travel around various parties. So Pexa will allow visibility for lenders and firms over the amount of what's being advanced and where that might be. Come completion time, when a completion actually executes, is when funds will shift and they will go to their recipient accounts that have been input by the parties involved and checked off, as you would imagine. And then the application for registration will go through to the land registry, so there's no need to sort of follow up and check on that as well. If there are any requisitions, we've just released the capability for requisition management in our platform for remortgage, admittedly, but that will carry through to other dealing types. So you can hopefully see already that a lot of inefficiencies will be reduced. And this is just really early days for us at the moment as well with remortgage. What we bring to market for sale purchase is very much to be determined, and we'll no doubt start off with a fairly a fairly thin product that will still deliver benefit to industry and then will grow over time. So I think the inefficiencies is a big one. The chasing in particular is, well, not having to chase is a big win that we hear about frequently in Australia, and I've already heard early feedback on in the UK, being able to provide more certainty to your customers, to your clients, that completion will occur and will occur at a particular time. Something also, I know I'm going back down memory lane a little bit in this conversation, but we commit to a date and time for completion here in Australia. And what we typically find is, if for some reason a transaction completes maybe half an hour later because various tasks were outstanding, firms are quite annoyed at that. And having now experienced what it's like in the UK, I just think, oh, you Australians, if you only knew, how could you have it? So that's also part of our North Star for the UK. So I think you will hopefully have to invite me back to talk about sale purchase when I've got a bit more detail to share, because I think that was a fairly muddled response for you.
Two quick questions, not focusing on too much detail, but I'm assuming when you roll out the sale and purchase, then that both opposing law firms would need to be party to the platform.
That's a good question.
And also, how does it work in terms of who pays for this?
Who pays? Okay, so with both, I'll have to share insights from Australia. Here in Australia, we created what in retrospect was a fairly restrictive product. So we did require for sale and purchase every party to the transaction to be a registered Pexa customer and then willing to complete the deal on Pexa in those early days. There was no flexibility with that. And what that meant in the context of change and the technology being very new was sometimes you'd have 2 of those 4, 3 of those 4, and the other one just absolutely not willing to give it a try, or coming up with every excuse under the sun not to do it. I described this as being real needle in haystack territory. You'd go out and you'd try to find a housing transaction that you could put through Pexa. And in those early days as well, we had quite a few scope limitations. So you'd find one that you would think could go through, and then someone wouldn't want to do it, and it would be heartbreaking. So in thinking about that, I know that we are sort of considering different options to bring to market in the UK, because we think we can deliver some benefits, some efficiencies, and some customer experience wins to parties without having everyone on. As I said before, whether that sees the light of day is to be determined. So I'll have to let you know on that one. And then on the topic of who pays here in Australia, and I feel like I've started every answer with that now, so forgive me. We provide our software to everyone who registers with us, so who sort of meets our eligibility criteria, which broadly speaking is, are you a regulated lender, regulated law firm? So no setup costs, no ongoing costs. We charge on a per transaction basis. So I can say it seems, personal view seems likely to me that will be the model that we follow in the UK. But again, we're not wedded to copying everything that was done in Australia.
So would you have that, because the 20 odd years ago, and I was, I'm old enough to, been around the block a few times with this. I was very sceptical 20 years ago of, the Land Registration Act and the setup of e-conveyancing, and not that it wasn't a laudable objective. I mean, I think at the time I objected the amount of money that was poured into it, but that was a different matter. But and as you say, the North Star, rather like that phrase. I should probably nick that. But the idea was, yeah, I really like it. But the idea was, of course, that you would have, electronic conveyancing where, you draft a contract online. The transfer would be drafted online. Everything would happen online. On completion, the data from the transfer would be pulled across onto the register, and miraculously on completion, all of the banks and building societies would be linked up. All of the mortgages would be redeemed simultaneously within a chain. The revenue would get all of its money, and the registration would happen. And personally, I always thought that, whilst I think it's important to have a North Star, I always thought that's never going to happen. Now, to be fair, 25 years on, it may well. But what I was going to ask about the link in the Pexa chain really is where's the revenue in all this? Because obviously to do our registrations we have to the revenue has to come first. So are you just kind of money transfer for completions to smooth the completion process at this early stage, or is the objective to try to do that whole big picture thing with revenue, mortgage redemptions, registration? Is that the North Star?
So everything that you just described is essentially the model here in Australia. So we have worked really closely with the revenue officers, the land registries, our HMRC equivalent, so our federal tax office for the VAT equivalent, for example, with commercial properties, and of course with industry, so all lenders and law firms and the representative bodies who look after their interests. So through that collaboration, a lot of collaboration, we have been able to get there. So for a sell and purchase transaction, in a matter of minutes, stamp duty is remitted to the Revenue Office. The lodgement case goes to the Land Registry. The documents are sort of automatically reviewed and registered unless a manual examination is required. And what most firms in particular have found is that they can close up their file on the day of completion, which was unheard of before technology was able to assist with that, and hopefully is something that we might be able to get to in the UK. So to bring out what I know you like now is the North Star comment, that is where we would like to get to in the UK. Hopefully it's not too tenuous a wish. We hope that we can get there, but we're also really conscious that it's early days, and as I mentioned before, we take an iterative approach to what we do. So what we develop, what we bring to market today is not what it's going to look like in a year or 5 years. Hopefully it's much bigger and better and almost sells itself, but I don't think any product quite does that. So that is quite the politician's response to your question. I appreciate, Lorraine. You're welcome to dig into me a little bit more.
Oh, no, that's fine. I think the politician's response is perfectly acceptable, Heather.
Okay.
So Stu, you're the top of a big law firm. Where are you with all this?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, if this can be rolled out across the UK, absolutely fantastic. If we could have a situation where we could close our file on the day of completion, would be all in. And I think every law firm would love that. So my main concern is just that the involvement of the banks. And, I know from other projects that I've consulted on over the years that there does seem to be sometimes not necessarily a lack of interest, but, converting that interest into actually process and making things difficult is of course very difficult. So I'm assuming that'll be a challenge.
Are well, I hope. Oh, sorry, Lorraine.
Well, no, no, go on. I've got a different question. So off you go, Heather. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say we haven't, I don't think, underestimated the challenge, and we're really conscious that what our solution does touches on a number of areas within the bank. So obviously their operational area, but also things like treasury, payments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not a one-stop shop for us to engage a lender and say, hey, this is Pexa and this is how it works and these are the benefits you'll have, and then they sign on the dotted line. If only things were that easy. There's a lot of engagement and a lot of helping them to understand what our product can do, how we can help them implement it. And even then, a lot of them have quite hefty sort of change programs, transformation programs, like I mentioned before. They're also facing into sort of readying themselves for the implications of consumer duty this year, and we hope we might be able to help with that in a small way as well. But I think they're juggling a lot of priorities, and it would probably be unfair to say that they're not interested. It's just that they've got to figure out where in the very lengthy to-do list, much longer than mine that's sitting next to me, where they can fit us in.
Yeah, Heather, I suppose we could probably talk to you all morning, but I suppose we ought to be kind of drawing the chat to a close. But maybe to arc back to one of the things you said at the outset was that one of the drivers initially in Australia for the Pexa initiative was how sort of fractured and fragmented the market was with your federal system. Certainly, as somebody who's now kind of slightly more outside the process in that I'm freelance, I don't have to, support a particular organisation or a particular view. And one thing I've noticed, and Stu and I talk about this a lot, particularly over the last few years, I think with the number of tech products in the market, and I have to say I think it's fair to say not come across anything that compares with Pexa. I might be wrong, but actually I think the challenge for law firms and the challenge for tech providers is, I think that the vast range of products is itself fragmenting the market over here. I think our market is becoming far more fragmented for a different reason. Because if you've got, and as Stu kind of alluded to, if you've got sort of multiple users of multiple different tech products, it's that fragmentation. So it's fragmentation in a different way. It's digital fragmentation rather than paper, but it's still there, isn't it?
Yes, I don't disagree with that. I have found over the last couple of years of speaking with stakeholders in the UK, that comes up in most conversations. It seems to me that most firms just really feel overwhelmed by the volume of solutions that are out there. And it's probably fair to say every solution out there is solving some sort of problem. But firms, in their approach to looking at some of these solutions, I think it's really easy to tangle yourself up in knots and sort of think, oh, goodness, I need that, I need this, it does X. And by no means am I an expert in this space, but I think you just have to sort of take yourself back for a moment and think, what problem are we trying to solve? What problem do we have in our firm, in our practice? What customer experience do we want to deliver? I think the legal industry has sort of largely not jumped on that train to the same extent that other industries have in recent years, and that's something to be really mindful of. I don't think as many firms today want to compete on price as they used to. So therefore, it sort of becomes about the experience they can deliver to customers and the certainty, if any, they can provide. And if that's a problem that's been identified or an opportunity that's been identified, I think that's when you go and seek out some tech solutions that might help to solve that, or review your processes or the capability you've got in your teams. But I think if you just went out there into the market and looked at the legal tech, prop tech, fintech, whatever else tech solutions that are out there, you would get overwhelmed very quickly.
I think so. So Stu, have you got any final thoughts or questions for Heather?
No, it was just great to have Heather on to explain, what Pexa are doing currently and what they hope to do in the future. So I really appreciate you coming on, Heather.
Thank you so much, Stu. And I feel like, given the tone of many of the questions, we might need a slot when we can share more about our sale and purchase solution.
Yeah, do. I mean, seriously, get in touch, because I know that, lots of our, viewers, we're very much slightly accidentally, really, speak to conveyancers, if you like, and sort of because we sort of share their experiences and certainly their pain over the last couple of years. So we'd really be delighted to have you back, Heather.
Oh, thank you so much. It was lovely to speak with you both.
Not at all. You take care now.
Take care, guys.
Bye.